Today I'm going to talk about why post-liberalism failed by James Patterson and Thomas Howes. It came out last month. I had a chance to read it and think about it. I think a lot of things in this book I have spoken about before, but the value of this book is that it exposes the intellectual provenance, if you can call it that, of the post-liberal thinkers of today, and it delineates or spells out what their ideology is, and it cites the specific instances in history where post-liberalism was attempted or tried, and how it miserably failed. Um, so it's a very powerful book, very enlightening book. Patterson is an associate professor of public affairs, the Institute of American Civics, the University of Tennessee's Baker School of Public Policy and Public Affairs, contributes to Law and Liberty. Thomas Howes, lecturer in politics at Princeton, editor-in-chief of the Vital Center, founder of the Reagan Caucus. The prologue is by Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone, who recently was promoted by the Vatican. He approves of the book. He condemns a post-liberalism. He summarizes the problems, and he writes the following, quote, post-liberalism is, quote, a fantasized idealism of the past that would reassert such ideas is not a sign of originality, but of historical amnesia. It fails to recognize that the church must live in the reality in which she finds herself here and now. Moreover, the problems these ideas generated in the past are the same ones they generate now. The erosion of legal constraint or restraint, the instrumentalization of religion, the reduction of politics to a struggle for domination rather than the pursuit of justice. End of quote. Okay? Number two, the foreword is by Catherine Ruth Pakaluk, who's got a PhD in economics. She writes, everywhere the post-liberal project was tried to produce economic stagnation, political repression, and the corruption of the church it claimed to serve. In several cases, it enabled or actively collaborated in genocide. Contemporary post-liberals such as Adrian Vermuele, Patrick Deneen, and Gladden Pappen have explicitly praised these regimes and the reactionary thinkers who legitimated them. She goes on to say, the authors, quote, show the intellectual lineage that connects today's movement to the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and the fascist collaboration of the 20th century. We do not need to dismantle the constitutional order of the United States to live as faithful Catholics. The post-liberal premise is false. You do not need a confessional state to have a faithful church. And she goes on to say, I'm a Catholic who holds that the natural law is noble by reason, that the family is the first society, that the state exists to serve and not to constitute the good life, and that the American constitutional tradition remains the best political arrangement yet devised for allowing men and women to live according to these truths. Um, that's a pretty powerful summation of this book. She also writes, too, in her foreword that she went to a conference with post-liberals and she got the very definite sense that they don't care about facts. They don't care about reality. They're into narratives. And so they don't really do any empirical research. They just have a narrative that you have to accept and that they try to push on people. In the introduction, the authors write that they define post-liberalism as the name for an authoritarian ideology dedicated to using state power to impose a reactionary Catholic vision of the church, family, and labor. They go on to say the post-liberals aim to use existing liberal state institutions against liberal purposes, annihilating individual liberty, economic opportunity, and freedom of conscience to establish a post-liberal order, end of quote, which they go on to say is even greater than the sacral kingships of yore. So the post-liberals are wrong. Then the authors go on to say, quote, post-liberalism is nothing less than authoritarianism dressed in Catholic vestments. So there are three parts of the book. Part one is very detailed. It's called American Post-Liberalism and Intellectual Sources, which gives you the sources of the ideas, of the conspiracy theories that basically today's American post-liberals are citing to and using. And they're all discredited. All these people are discredited, these sources that the modern post-liberals are using. The second unit is a review of historical post-liberal regimes and why they fail. And then unit three is called Persistence of Post-Liberal Failure, which talks about the Catholic position on church and state, as well as on civil society and on government. Okay, so what you have in Unit 1, when they talk about American post-liberalism and the intellectual sources, they give the definition of post-liberalism, and they talk about this ideology doing the long march through the institutions, just like the left. They want to be like the left, really. They really want to be like the communists. They want to instill certain principles that the communists and the left want to put in there, along with authoritarianism. The politics deals, what they want is a very strong political party that establishes control and autocracy, dictatorship. That working families are subsidized by the state. You don't need foreign immigration unless they're Catholics, and the U.S. would produce its own industrial and post-industrial goods. This leads to the next point, which they want America isolated, because America is the liberal imperium that, quote, imposes objectively immoral beliefs like individual liberty and economic opportunity onto more traditional foreign nations, end of quote. And then they say that the post-liberals teach that America is exploiting these populations in some way. Okay, so the origination comes from Deneen, and basically Deneen came up with a false idea of liberalism, a too broad idea of liberalism, which I talked about a little bit before, but he says that liberalism refers to the emancipation of the person from natural limits, and those limits include economic, political, and communal limits. And so basically that should send a shiver down your spine, because then government is going to exist to put limits on you, to make sure you do the right thing. That's totalitarianism. Okay, also too, the authors of this book, Patterson and House, talk about how, Robert Riley noted, Deneen misconstrues, twists a statement by Madison, Federalist 10, about the different faculties of man. Madison did not say that all these different faculties should be nurtured by the state, but rather that the state should allow man to exercise the ability to choose these different faculties and then to work accordingly. So they go and they debunk what Deneen is claiming the founder said, and show that by Deneen basing his whole position on that, what the founder said, this discredited view of the founders, that his whole line of thinking is wrong. Okay, so other post-liberals are the Front Porch Republic blog, Vermuele, American Affairs, the Josiahs with Edmund Waldstein, Gladden Pappen, Amari, Chad Pecknold, Philip Pilkington, Edward Fazer, the magazines of Compact, Unheard, The Lamp, Alan Phimester, and Father Thomas Crean's Integralism and Manual Political Philosophy. Basically, the sources for the modern American post-liberals come from a number of conspiracy theorists, a number of guys who were upset that the ancient regime fell apart, the old order fell apart, with the Enlightenment, with the change in societies. And so they created conspiracy theories. And guess who was the object of conspiracy theories? You got it. The Masons and the Jews. The Masons and the Jews were the guys who destroyed society using liberalism to cloak their many conspiracies to destroy everyone's morality and get powerful. That is the conspiracy theory that it comes up over and over again in the sources that Deneen and the other American post-liberals cite to. There's a discussion about papal supremacy, which is very good, ultramontanism. There's a discussion about the following figures who the American post-liberals cite to: Abbé Augustin Barruel, Jean-Baptiste Simonini, Joseph de Maistre, Louis de Bonald, Louis Veuillot, and then Felix Sarda y Salvani, who wrote Liberalism is a Sin, and he authored The Jewish Question in Europe, a running screed in La Civiltà Cattolica in the 1890s. They talk about Hilaire Belloc, who talked about the Jews, Charles Marat, who was a monarchist, and then the founder of Action Française, which Pius XI, of course, condemned. And then they also talk about Karl Schmitt. They love Karl Schmitt because he makes the friend-enemy distinction, and he talked about the need of exception or emergency powers, and he said we have to mount a counterinsurgency using Freemasonry tactics, a Catholic counter-conspiracy, and Karl Schmitt referred to Juan Donoso Cortez. So what you see over and over again with these post-liberal sources is you see this idea of us versus them. Okay, it's identity politics. It's not about working together in collaboration in society to make society better. It's us versus them, and that has terrible consequences because it leads to the concentration of power. It leads to conflict. It leads to the loss of all those liberties that I mentioned earlier. It leads to the end of competition, economic stagnation, poverty, and ultimately war. You end up fighting wars of one type or another. Kevin Valier, who is quoted approvingly by the authors, and who is opposed to post-liberalism, writes that Joseph de Maistre and Schmitt were perhaps selective in their private commitments to the faith, but they advocated all the same for the abandonment of public deliberation, natural law, civil rights, and liberties in favor of erecting an even more powerful absolute state under a single ruler. End of quote. And they did that by us versus them. Well, of course, the oligarchs, the plutocrats, like that kind of thinking, don't they? So that's why you get J.D. Vance being supported by guys like Peter Thiel. Okay, Unit 2 deals with historical post-liberal regimes: Portugal, Brazil, Argentina, Belgium, Vichy France, Austria, Spain, Slovakia, Croatia. Some of these failed before they started. The post-liberals never really got into power because the tyrants, the dictators, were just using them, and the dictators just wanted power, and the post-liberals, frankly, scared the dictators. And then also, too, the authors say that post-liberalism failed because there's no way for it to succeed. And it led to economic mismanagement, political dysfunction, internal corruption, and essentially war. Post-liberalism depends on conspiracy theories. It treats liberalism too broadly. There's American liberalism, if you want to call it that, and then there's French liberalism, if you want to call it that. It treats liberalism with a broad brush. It gives it an agency of its own, which you can't do, as the authors say. It treats it like a blind historical force. And it relies, like I said, on conspiracies and no evidence. There's no empirical evidence here. They reject evidence. The authors conclude that Catholic integralism still belongs in the dustbin of history, where the Second Vatican Council finally left it after witnessing for many firsthand the unintended and not so unintended consequences that were reviewed earlier in the book. They go on to say corporatism still creates, which corporatism is a big part of the post-liberal idea. You have guilds, you have these groups that are supposed to keep everybody in their place, basically. Corporatism still creates incentives for state collusion with corporations to exploit the public without the necessary information to control the centralized economy. So what you really have is you have a failure of this ideology, which is being brought back again without any empirical basis. What post-liberalism does is it leads to the rise of dictators and tyranny, which leads to harm of the person, destruction of the person. It elevates the importance of the group, whatever that group is, usually ethnic, racial group, maybe a religious group. It pits groups against each other, conflict in society. You lose economic opportunity, you lose prosperity, you lose mobility, social mobility. You scapegoat people as the solution instead of trying to use science, trying to use reason, and it destroys creativity and innovation. And it allows for the rise of regimes without any sort of accountability or transparency, for that matter. It's a failed ideology, As the authors show, it was tried about 100 years ago. It failed, and it's coming back, obviously, because there are people who have grievances, who are troubled, and there are oligarchs and plutocrats who want power. Uh, and, this is a good book to help us understand that, Christendom actually was rejected ultimately. And the authors even talk about Christendom. They say that the church actually gave people's countries the tools they needed to break out of Christendom. So Christendom was actually ultimately rejected by countries, by peoples. And the Catholic confessional states were ultimately rejected by people. So this is a very good book. Provides a lot of information that explains a lot of these names of these thinkers from the 1700s and 1800s, early 1900s that you may have heard that are treated as authorities, but they're not authorities. They're just conspiracy theory guys. That's it. And of course, the guilty people, the scapegoats, are the Jews and the Masons. So definitely read this book. I think it is very powerful. It's very enlightening. Thank you.